You know those old 60s wildlife shorts? That iconic, haunting woodwind melody? For a lot of people, it was this moment of total national pride.
Exactly. You can almost see the grainy footage of the elk grazing. It felt so safe, didn't it? Almost like a collective lullaby for the country.
It really did. But it's unsettling when you look back at the files from that era. Because behind that televised serenity, a very different kind of predator was stalking the actual hinterlands.
It's a heavy contrast to sit with. While families were gathered around that warm blue glow of the TV, something was moving in the static-filled silence of the real Canadian Shield. This is where the wildlife terror actually begins.
You know, when you look at those old case files, it's that 16 millimeter film grain that really gets to you. It has this way of softening the edges of the world, but it makes the shadows feel, deeper, more impenetrable.
It's unsettling, honestly. You can almost see the grainy footage playing out, those muted Canadian pines and that heavy, washed-out gray sky. There's a real melancholia to that specific 1970s palette.
Exactly. And the chilling part is how the killers seemed to actually understand that visual language. They didn't just hide in the boreal forest. They used it as this vast, indifferent stage for what they were doing.
Right. It makes you realize the wilderness wasn't just a backdrop for these crimes. In a very steady, haunting way, it was an accomplice.
It's striking how that 1965 to 79 window perfectly mirrors the peak of the Hinterland Who's Who vignettes. You can almost see the grainy film, right? That national push to get everyone back to nature.
Exactly. And it created this almost false sense of security. People were heading deep into the northern Ontario bush with nothing but canvas tents and a lot of optimism, looking for the moose and beavers they'd seen on TV.
Right, but they didn't realize that the silence in those woods isn't empty. It's unsettling, really. It's a heavy, watching presence that doesn't exactly welcome intruders.
It's a sobering thought. You can feel the weight of it, that while they were out there looking for a connection, the wilderness was already watching them.
You know, that sense of safety we all cling to, it really started to fracture way up in the Pine Barrens, about 200 miles north of Sudbury.
It's unsettling. It was late October, and you can almost feel that ground starting to harden with the first frost.
Exactly. A geological team was out there charting the land when they found what they thought was just abandoned camping gear tucked under a heavy waterlogged tarp.
Right, but when they pulled that canvas back, the reality was much heavier. It wasn't just old supplies. It was a campsite that had been violently interrupted.
It's a haunting image. Everything was just frozen in time by the peat, like a macabre photograph that the earth refused to let go of.
When you look back at these 1970s cold cases, you realize the arrival of law enforcement was its own kind of struggle, this mechanical battle of man against nature.
It's unsettling to think about. You can almost see the grainy footage, those heavy rear-wheel drive Plymouth Furies just fighting for traction on those unpaved logging roads.
Exactly. Their cherry top lights spinning against that massive canopy of spruce, looking almost useless. And then these investigators step out, wearing city fedoras and wool trench coats that just weren't meant for that biting wind.
It's a grounded reminder that out there, their badges held no real authority over the elements. You have to feel for them, standing there while the crime scene was already being reclaimed by the moss and the mire.
You know, as you dig into these old files, you start to see it, that strange cinematic quality to the scenes. It's almost like they weren't just crimes, they were staged.
It's unsettling, honestly. You look at those photos and they feel like stills from a nature documentary of the time. You can almost see the grainy footage playing in your head.
Exactly. That's why a local journalist came up with that name, the 16 millimeter ghost. Because he wasn't just a suspect, he was like a glitch on a film reel.
A phantom existing only in the peripheral vision of the public. It's heavy stuff.
but it really captures the feeling of a shadow that shouldn't be there, leaving us with nothing but these unanswered questions.
So, I was digging into those old RCMP files from the 70s, and this one theory really stands out. The local conservation officer called it nature's witness.
It's unsettling, isn't it? He noticed the wildlife acting wrong. Birds migrating weeks too early, wolf packs suddenly steering clear of valleys they'd hunted in for years.
Exactly. You can almost see the grainy footage of those empty woods. It wasn't just a typical predator on the loose. The animal sensed something that simply didn't belong to the natural order.
Right. It's like the entire forest fell into this terrified hush. It makes you realize that whoever this was, they didn't just move through the trees, they actually displaced the very atmosphere of the wild.
You have to imagine the sheer desperation they were feeling. They actually turned to the CBC archives, digging through thousands of hours of raw wildlife B-roll.
It's unsettling to think about it, isn't it? Just miles and miles of film.
Exactly. The theory was that a camera crew, maybe focused on a caribou or a nesting eagle, had inadvertently caught the killer in the background.
A needle in a haystack made of celluloid. You can almost see those officers in the dark rooms, eyes straining against the flicker of the projector, just waiting for something malicious to break that serene wilderness.
So, we're looking at this film reel labeled Algonquin Interior, 1969. It starts out so peacefully, just a steady shot of a beaver dam in the woods.
Right, but then you notice the figure in the deep background, 300 yards out. They're wearing that classic red and black plaid jacket, but they aren't hiking or fishing. They're just standing perfectly still, facing the camera.
It's unsettling. When the investigators blew the footage up, the grain was so thick, it left this dark void where a face should be. You can almost see that grainy texture, can't you?
Exactly. It's this heavy, grounded realization that while the lens was capturing the killer was standing there, watching them right back.
You know, it's unsettling when you realize what was actually captured on those old nature tapes from the 70s.
Exactly. When the engineers stripped away the narration and the music, they found these audio fragments that just didn't belong in the wilderness.
Right. The sharp, metallic click of a rifle bolt, a truck door slamming somewhere off camera. You can almost see the grainy footage shifting into something much darker.
And that whistle, that's the part that really stays with you. It mimicked the loons, but it had this rigid, human rhythm to it.
It's a chilling sonic footprint. It shows someone who was comfortable enough to just blend his own menace into the natural soundscape while he watched.
It's grounded, in a way, but deeply haunting. You're hearing the predator hiding in plain sight.
Looking back at these cold cases from the 70s, you start to realize the Canadian Shield wasn't just a backdrop. It was an accomplice.
Exactly. It's that muskeg, a heavy soup of moss and water that just swallows evidence whole. It's unsettling to think about.
It really is. In the summer, the black flies are thick enough to choke you, and by winter, that ground turns into iron. Whoever did this knew the land would do the heavy lifting for them.
And the science of it is so haunting. Depending on the spot, the swamp would either skeletonize a body or mummify it in the peat. You can almost see those officers wading chest deep into the freezing muck, disturbing that ancient, heavy silence.
You know, looking back at these files from the 70s, it's unsettling how much those investigators were fighting against the environment itself. It wasn't just a hunt for a person, it was a struggle against the elements.
Exactly. You can almost see the grainy footage in your mind, right? They had the RCMP trying to apply these new forensic standards, but the bush just didn't care about the scientific method. It's heavy when you think about it.
It really is. I mean, imagine being on a scene and your fingerprint powder is clumping in the humidity, or your camera just freezes solid in the sub-zero wind. The high-tech gear of the time was basically useless out there.
It's a lot to wrap your head around. They were forced to pivot, hiring local trappers and indigenous guides just to interpret the land. It was this total clash between the modern world and something much more primal.
And that's the tragedy of these cases. The killer found that gap between the two worlds. They weren't just hiding in the trees. They were exploiting the limitations of the system to become a ghost in the machine. When you look back at these files from the 70s, you start to see a specific profile. It was the very people those Hinterland Who's Who shorts were targeting: urban families on road trips, birdwatchers with their binoculars.
Exactly. It's unsettling, really. They saw the wilderness as a park, something tamed and beautiful to be visited. You can almost see the grainy film footage of them straying off the marked trails just for a better view or a rare sighting.
They lacked that local instinct, that inherent fear that keeps you safe. They were innocent in the truest sense, bringing a kind of city naivete into a domain where the only law is survival of the fittest.
It's a heavy realization. In a world that unforgiving, it seems their trust was ultimately their undoing.
It's striking how often these reports lead back to those lonely, scattered outposts, the single pump gas stations and those roadside diners where the coffee always smelled a bit burnt.
It's unsettling. You can almost see the grainy footage when you read about the bait shops and that sharp scent of formaldehyde. These were the only places a person could even stop for supplies out there.
Right, and the proprietors all remembered a similar figure, this transient shadow who paid in cash and never took his eyes off the door.
Exactly. But the descriptions were always so vague, just average height or wearing a parka. It's a grounded kind of scary. He was everyone and no one, just a reflection of that deep isolation you find in the rural Canadian landscape.
We often focus on the clues, but we can't overlook what this case actually did to the investigators back then. Hunting someone in that kind of wilderness, it's like staring into a void until it starts staring back at you.
It's deeply unsettling. The detectives I've spoken with actually use the term bush madness. After weeks in the field, between the endless repetition of the trees and that constant wind, your mind just starts to fracture.
Exactly. You can almost see the grainy footage of them out there, starting to see the killer behind every single pine and every shifting shadow.
And that's the real toll. Even the warm, reassuring voices on the TV back home started to sound like a taunt, just a steady reminder of the peace they felt they could no longer protect.
So, picture this: the dead of winter in 1976. Deep in a valley you could only reach by snowshoe, they find this squat, unlisted cabin. And honestly, it's like something out of a fever dream.
It's unsettling. You've got the walls completely plastered with torn-out pages from wildlife guidebooks, just this chaotic collage of birds and plants. You can almost see the grainy footage of the investigators walking into that room.
Exactly. But the detail that really sticks with me, the cabin was still warm. The scent of wood smoke and old grease was hanging in the air, and there was a half-eaten meal sitting right there on the table.
It's heavy, thinking about how close they were. But despite that warmth, there was no one left to find. The 16mm ghost had already slipped away into the whiteout, just like he always did.
You look at those winters in 78 and 79, and it's like the trail didn't just go cold. It was literally buried under feet of powder.
It's unsettling. You can almost see the grainy footage of those storms, and then the funding just dries up. The focus shifts to the city, and these cases get boxed away.
Exactly. They end up in an RCMP basement where the humidity starts degrading paper. It's a tragic parallel, really. The dampness eating the files while the muskeg was doing the same thing to the evidence out in the wild.
It feels like the wilderness won. It kept its secrets. And then the disappearances just stop, leaving behind this silence that's somehow more terrifying than the violence ever was.
It's fascinating how by 1980, the whole mood just shifted. Those iconic Hinterland Who's Who shorts didn't feel like a call to adventure anymore.
Exactly. That haunting flute melody, it started to carry this subtle anxiety. You can almost see the grainy footage and feel the chill.
Right. It changed how we looked at the land. Parents suddenly became much stricter about how far the kids could wander into the tree line at the cottage.
It's unsettling, really. Our connection to the wilderness suffered a bruise that wouldn't heal. We started to realize the Hinterland wasn't just a park. It was a place where someone could be quietly erased.
You know, looking back at the Hinterland murders, it's one of those cases that feels like a permanent shadow over the Canadian landscape, a true enigma.
It really is. And whether people are debating it on a forum or in some quiet small-town tavern, the theories always circle back to the same place. Was it a drifter, or maybe just the indifference of the wilderness itself?
Exactly. But the hardest part to swallow is that the physical evidence is just gone, reclaimed by the moss and the rot of the forest.
It's unsettling. You can almost see the grainy police footage playing back in your mind. Now, all we're left with are the old reports and that specific sense of unease you get when you're alone in the deep woods and you start listening just a little too closely to the wind.
You know, those Hinterland Who's Woo shorts? They're such a staple of that 1970s landscape, aren't they? We go back to them on YouTube now just to catch a glimpse of what feels like a simpler time.
Exactly. You can almost see the grainy footage starting up. But when you're looking at these old cases, that nostalgia, it shifts. It starts to carry that heavy, metallic taste of fear.
It really does, because as beautiful as the wilderness is, it's also incredibly vast, full of 1,000 places to hide and never be found. It's unsettling.
It is. You hear that iconic flute melody, and it doesn't just feel like a nature documentary anymore. It feels like an echo lost in the pines.
It stays with you. For those of you who remember those original shorts, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Does this change things? Will you ever look at the Canadian woods the same way again?